Have you ever tried to communicate with your spouse and it went south because they got defensive or they misunderstood you, or maybe you overreacted to something they said because it was super triggering? If that's the case for you, then this video is going to address that. I'm going to teach you a 3-step technique to help you communicate better in your marriage. And it's really a way that you can be heard and understood so that you feel closer after communicating. And this technique comes from Imago Therapy. If you follow this technique, you're going to feel so much stronger. You're going to feel so much more on the same team, and you're going to be able to really talk about anything you want without worrying about things blowing up. So the technique I'm going to share is from Imago Therapy, which is that approach developed by Harville Hendricks and Helen Hunt. It's detailed in the classic relationship book called Getting the Love You Want. This was developed in the early 80s. So before I get into the technique, I'm just going to briefly explain, if you don't already know what Imago Therapy is. The term imago is Latin for image. And within the context of this therapy or this modality, it refers to an unconscious image of familiar love. It's an unconscious image of familiar love. Everyone has this image, according to the theory, and it's what I call, it's a template of primary relationships that was developed in childhood that we tend to model our adult relationships on. And the theory is that our unconscious drive is to get our partner, who's similar to our parents in ways that we may or may not even notice or understand, to change in specific ways to give us love in the form that our parents or caregivers did not, or that they were falling short in. So most of this, like I said, it occurs behind the scenes in your unconscious mind, and it's not something that you might be aware of unless you've already had some kind of therapy. But if you look under the hood, you'll be able to see this. I found that the theory is pretty spot on, and it applies to basically 100% of the people that I've ever worked with, even if they denied it in the beginning or really didn't see it in the beginning. Once you explore and you dig a little bit deeper, it's pretty clear that most of us unconsciously choose a spouse who's in some way going to resemble the negative aspects of our parents or caregivers, and our spouse is going to recreate those familiar experiences in childhood. And it doesn't have to be similar in terms of personality. Your spouse may be very different on the surface from your parent or parents, but the negative image of those unmet needs in childhood is going to be recreated by this person. So this person you've selected because they're actually uniquely unqualified to meet those unmet needs, or they're going to actually be the exact person that will push your buttons the most. And what's interesting is that while you could have chosen a person that meets those needs more easily, you're not actually interested in that person. You're not actually interested in those people because that would be boring to your psyche. You want somebody who's actually going to feel familiar, somebody that it's that specific person that if you could get them to give it to you, that's what's going to mean the most. You want them to give you what was missing, and only them, because that's going to give an old story a different ending. That fantasy is extremely gratifying. So anyway, getting back to the communication piece, with that in mind, the reason that communication gets derailed in marriage, and in all relationships really, is because the triggers around the unmet needs get activated, right? You get triggered, and then that sabotages healthy ways of communicating. It's that fight or flight reaction, especially if it's a wound from childhood. If we hear things the wrong way, we hear them the wrong way, they say something in a blaming way, or we get upset and we escalate and we come at them the wrong way. It's very heightened. The stakes are very high, so something small can become something very big. Now, the solution to that is to be able to communicate in a very structured way that is as non-triggering as possible, to override the tendency for the wounded parts of us to run the show. So how this works is, with this dialogue, it's an intentional dialogue. It's got a specific structure. It has 3 parts, and it helps you connect around this, around what's coming up for you. First, there is mirroring, which is where you're going to repeat what you've heard your spouse tell you, literally paraphrasing and mirroring back what you've heard until you get it right, and vice versa. And then in the validation phase, whoever's hearing the message, like the communication receiver, is going to summarize and express an understanding of the points that the other person raised. And that goes beyond mirroring, because it's not just understanding what they said and like saying it out loud back to them, but actually expressing why what they're saying makes sense, even if you don't agree with it. And then the final phase is empathy, which is the final step of this dialogue process. This is where the person who's receiving the message from their spouse actively appreciates the experience that they're describing from their point of view. So I'm going to give an example of how this works in all 3 parts. Let's say for the first step that there's something that you need to communicate to your spouse. There's something that is really irritating you, and you need to bring it up. You're going to start with an I statement. You're going to share yourself and your thoughts with I language. And that's very, very important. So instead of talking about your spouse and making you statements, pointing fingers or generalizing, you're going to share about yourself. So for example, I might say something like, when I saw the dirty dishes in the sink, I felt burdened by more work around the house. I'm already so stressed, and I felt this knot in my stomach, and my brain just went to this place of like, oh great, here I go, more work for me. So that's an I statement way of articulating that. Then my partner, my spouse, is going to mirror back what I've said through paraphrasing. And then they're going to say, okay, let me see if I've got this. This is what you said. Did I get that right? Now, if they didn't understand it enough to paraphrase, they can always get curious and ask, is there more? Can you say more about that? Because sometimes you might hear something and you don't even understand it enough to paraphrase. Get curious if that's the case. Then once you feel like, let's say you're the one that was communicating, I'm the one that's communicating that with this example specifically, and my spouse will paraphrase it back to me and ask me if I got it right. If I said they did get it right, then we can move on to the next phase. But if it wasn't right, then I'm going to keep clarifying it until they get it right. That's the key. You can't even go on to the next step. And why this is important is that mirroring helps you really listen to what the other person's actually saying, rather than listening to the reactions and responses that's going on in your head, right? And any misunderstanding that's based on past experiences or assumptions that you might make. So you have to know that you're hearing each other correctly first before you can go any further. Then the second phase is validation. So once you've properly mirrored, or let's say they've mirrored it back to you with what you've shared, and it's accurate, then they can move into actually validating what you're saying. So I'm going to flip this around. Let's say your spouse comes to you with something that bothered them, like when you came home later than we talked about last night, it felt like you didn't take our time seriously, or that you didn't want to hang out with me as much as I want to hang out with you. That might be something that you don't agree with, but after it's been paraphrased correctly, then you can validate this. Now, this is going to be hard if you already have, let's say you have a different perspective on things. You don't see it that way. You think that they've incorrectly assessed the situation. But in order to connect, it's important for you to realize that what your partner's saying, it makes sense for them. You don't have to agree on the premise of their feelings. It's not about right or wrong. That's the thing. That's where people get derailed. They get into convincing mode and power struggles and arguing about objective truth. But it's really about the connection and being able to see it from their point of view. In this Imago dialogue, the connection is the most important thing. And who is right and who is wrong doesn't matter. It's really a moot point because both people can be right. If you pan out of the situation with a wide enough lens, you'll see that both people can be right. But let's just say that you disagree with what they're saying. You can still validate, and then you can maybe discover that you find a solution that you wouldn't have found if you had been stuck in right or wrong, because the underlying pain is what needs to be addressed. That's the whole point of this communication. So what this looks like is, let's say after you've summarized back to your partner, you've paraphrased, they said, yep, you got that right. Then you can validate by saying something simple like, that makes sense to me, or you know what, if I were you, I might feel that way too. You don't have to agree with them, but you're just showing that you respect their reality. And you could even go the extra mile if you really understand where they're coming from and say, you know what, that makes sense to me because I know your dad was never there, or your dad was always late, and you were left waiting and you didn't know. And so I get why you would have that experience. And offering that is such a gift. You'll probably see it on their face. You'll probably see the relief or hear them breathe a sigh of relief. And you haven't lost anything. You haven't lost anything. Even if in your mind you're like, well, that isn't the right interpretation. That doesn't matter. Then the third step is going even farther away in terms of creating a connection, which is empathy. And that's going beyond the thought process and actually trying to understand how they would feel. It's not just understanding their perception and their point of view, but their feelings. And feelings are simple. Feelings are very, this is the easy part. There's not a lot of primary emotions. You can just make a guess, like, I can imagine you would have been feeling hurt or confused or uncertain. You're just putting yourself in their vantage point and imagining how you might feel based on what they've said to you. Or if you really don't know how they might feel, or you can't imagine why you would have a negative emotion in that situation, you don't have to know that you would feel the same way. You just have to know what those emotions are. Like, you know, if you've ever felt sad before, even if you wouldn't feel sad in that situation, you can imagine what that would be like. So if you can ask them and get curious and ask them how it made them feel, or make a really your best guess on how you could imagine that they would feel, that's going to go a long way. And because that's going to help them feel truly heard and understood, and like, you're with me. That's the emotional connection piece. Then you can problem solve. And I've talked about that before. But this is such a powerful technique. It just is not going to work unless you're really very strict with it. You're going to have to make sure that you practice your eye language, because it's easier said than done. You're going to have to be willing to soften your position of rightness, to be humble and open in a way that will allow true, authentic connection to happen. And you're going to have to really be emotionally intelligent to be able to know how something might feel, right? Practicing your empathy and being willing to do that. You have to move off of your positionality, and you have to be willing to follow the structure meticulously. That also includes the paraphrasing, which I think a lot of people want to just overlook or bypass the paraphrasing part of it because you think you get it and it feels really tedious. But that's a really important part of this process, and you don't want to skip it. So that's it for me today, you guys. I am glad that you tuned in. Thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments below, and I will get back to you. And I'll see you next time.